Thank you for coming. My name is Angel O'Brien, and I'm a member of the board of the Photography Council. I usually mention that I'm terrible at public speaking, but somehow I always end up being the one to do this, so maybe I'm getting a little better at it. So the Photography Council has been hosting these lunchtime talks since 2009, and today is our 139th. Quite a lot of amazing photographers who have come here from Portland, Oregon, all over the country, and even internationally. So always lots of very exciting information and photography to look at. For those of you who are interested in getting emails in the future about future talks, we do have an email list in the lobby that you can sign up on your way out. Also, if you would please take the time now to turn off or silence your cell phones, that would be amazing. And then with that, I'm going to introduce C. Meier, our speaker for today. C is an artist, curator, and community organizer based here in Portland. Their art practice explores materiality, reveling in the hybridization of processes including painting, drawing, and photographic methods. They earned their MFA in photography from Columbia College in Chicago in 2017 and a BFA in studio art from Pacific Lutheran University in 2004. Meier has exhibited at Candela Books and Gallery, Hyde Park Art Center, Mana Contemporary in Chicago, Filter Space, Blue Sky here in Portland, Nine Gallery, also here in Portland, Solace Gallery, Carnation Contemporary, and others. Their work is part of the permanent collection of the Pacific at Lutheran University in Tacoma. Meier curated Creative Resilience Critical Mass 2025 Top 50 at Blue Sky in, never mind, sorry. Size Matters for Medium Photo in 2023 and co-curated Recollection at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in 2017. In 2025, Meier started Unfold, a DIY gallery in their Southeast Portland apartment where they curate exhibitions and host artist salons. Professional roles include collections manager at the Museum of Contemporary Photography from 2018 to 2020, studio assistant to artist Barbara Caston, and exhibitions director at Blue Sky Oregon Center for the Photographic Arts since 2021. And one more reminder to please silence or turn off your cell phones. And with that, I will hand the floor over to C, and thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Angel and Heidi, the rest of the Photo Council, for the invitation to come talk. It's really exciting to be up here in front of so many familiar faces and friends. But many of you maybe only know me in my role as exhibitions director at Blue Sky and not so much about my own art practice. So I'm very excited to be sharing that with y'all today. I'm going to start off with introducing you to my most current work, if you're not familiar with it. And then I'm going to move through and talk about sort of my journey as an artist, some of my favorite influences, and then what you've all wanted to know is my process. How the heck do I make these? So Haptics are my most recent body of work. I create colorful photograms using Polaroid film, utilizing the most essential qualities of photography, light and light-sensitive material. All works are made without the use of a camera. The Polaroid film offers a light-sensitive canvas of immediacy and physicality. Through its materiality, I explore light, color, form, absence, and presence. I use a hands-on, semi-controlled approach paired with improvisation and chance. The film is extremely light sensitive, so I have to work completely in darkness, and therefore I have to give up a lot of control, which is hard for a Virgo. And I only use touch as a guide rather than sight. I'm interested in the ideas born out of the early 20th century, pre and post World War I, the avant-garde, including constructivism, suprematism, and concrete art. And I'll go in a little more into that when I talk about my influences. Concrete photography was born out of the ideas of concrete art, and in this way emphasizes the photograph as an object to behold rather than to look through, to be made rather than taken. The photograph is an object and only represents itself. The work is light harnessed. And I did bring some actual live photographs you can see. And feel free to come up after the talk. I do have more work here if you want to see them in person. But I think it's important with this work, part of that is that seeing these as an object is part of it. It's been a kind of a challenge as an artist that works in this way to get my work out there because it kind of manifests differently digitally. And as we know, on most of our submission things out there, you submit digitally. And so these images are scans with the fluorescent background included, because I do see the sort of frame to be actually a part of the piece itself. There's another one. Each of these photograms is completely unique and cannot be reproduced. In the end, my work aims to challenge traditional notions of what a photograph is and how it functions. This work pushes the viewer to consider an alternative reality and function of photography, one that exists outside of representation and reproduction. Robert Heineken aptly described in this distinction in photography, saying, "We constantly tend to misuse or misunderstand the term reality in relation to photographs. The photograph itself is the only thing that is real." Okay, now we're gonna take you on a little journey of little C. This is me at 17. I have a friend here who was in my art class with me, who knew me. This is 1999, 2000. I was super fortunate to have an extremely amazing art teacher in high school, Judy Vogelin, I grew up here in the Portland area. I went to Hillsborough High School, and Judy taught there for many years. She's currently at Sitka Center teaching a workshop. If you don't know Judy, check her out, she's amazing. But she was super influential as a young person and young artist. And at that time, I was more focused on painting. But as you can see, I was really into color and weird color. And definitely influenced by artists like Kirchner. When I got to college, I was an art history minor, and I remember in modern art history class getting super excited about learning about German Expressionism, because I just love the way that the artist used color and had this wild action, and the weird crab girl, I don't even know what's happening there with that hat. But it's been fun to kind of look back at who excited me at a young age. This is me in college. I studied in London for a semester, and that's where I took my black and white darkroom class. So this is a self-portrait I made. And so I can take pictures. But yeah, and this is me looking very serious and arty. And at that time, I was kind of more interested in a sociology perspective of photography, which I'll show you. But I also, while I was studying in London, got to see these in person. This is at the Tate Modern. It's the Rothko room, and it's magical, and was the first time, I think, that I had seen a Rothko in person. I was already familiar with Rothko's work, But to be surrounded by these like massive paintings was just really freaking cool. And I think like that's something that I'm very drawn to, is the art that gives you a feeling, and it doesn't have to represent anything in particular, but there's just something that you get like on a deep level. And so that was definitely inspirational. But this is going back to kind of the work I made in London. I was coming from kind of more of a curious sociologist sort of lens, and this was a project that I was curious about how people's heights affected the way they like were treated or felt were treated in the world. And so these were three friends at different heights that I photographed separately and interviewed on a little handheld recorder. And then after I developed the pictures, I then wrote directly on the print what they had said in the interview, on looking like it was part of the bricks. And when I got back in my last year of college, I took color photography back. I went to PLU in Tacoma. And in my Robert Hirsch Exploring Color Photography book that I still have, there was a description of photographers that has stuck with me, which was, there are visual types and there are haptics. And a visual type was described as someone that wants to preserve the illusion of the world, unmanipulated, not much going on in the darkroom. They make their print, they're really into the zone system, very little cropping, etc. And then there are the haptics, who are way more into their bodily sensations, subjective experience, psychological, spiritual, experimental. The word haptic comes from the Greek haptos, meaning laying hold of. And so it's more about people that, the study that this came from was a difference between people who were working with clay that used more sight as their guide. Those were the visuals. And the folks that used touch as a guide were the haptics. And I remember when I read this, I was like, I don't know, which one am I? And at the time, I kind of was like, I feel like I sort of straddle the two, but then I got into color photography and I started making weird stuff like this. This is emulsion transfer that, alas, because of most of this type of Polaroid film being gone, you can't really make these anymore. But this was a kind of a mix between my sort of painting background and collage and photography, made with taking a picture with a slide film and using a little gadget to transfer that onto the Polaroid film, and then transfer that onto watercolor paper. And so what I found was that I tended to make work that had lots of stages and layers, like take a picture, but then I wanted to do something with that, and then I wanted to put it on a bottle. And so this work was about emotions. This one is ego, and it has an emulsion lift, which is similar to emulsion transfers, but that one you can actually manipulate and put on different surfaces. So the emulsion transfer is on a bottle in this one. After college, I spent 10 years up in Seattle, where I kind of struggled to make artwork for a long time, just getting out of school and not having that studio space, or just getting into the working world. But I did get really into encaustic painting during this time. And so I wasn't doing a ton of photography, but my interest in encaustics actually came from my photography background, in that you can take a photo and do a transfer onto the wax. So some of the work was more photographic. This one I had started in 2012, and then I actually reworked it during lockdown. And so this was sort of the final version of it. But if you're not familiar with encaustic, it's working with hot wax and layers and paint. And then flash forward to grad school. I started grad school in 2015 in Chicago. So this is me at the end of that, finishing my thesis. looking kind of tired but, and serious. And during grad school, I was more wrestling with the edge between representation and abstraction, where I was still connected with this idea of something looking like something, but kind of messing with you on purpose. And was kind of still really stuck on, like, I think the move from Seattle to Chicago was weird. And I was sort of grappling with this idea of like my like psychological landscape that made me feel safe versus something more unfamiliar. And so I was more interested in sort of this like in between where like this is actually, these two pieces are cyanotypes of just like crumpled tracing paper in a wet tray with the infrared light reflecting. And then I took a picture with a camera. Whoa. So that's the kind of work I was up to in graduate school. I was continuing to play with the instant image. Polaroid at that time was sort of not happening, so the Impossible project was a stand-in to be able to make instant work. And this was kind of the culmination of my graduate work. That was part of Ground Floor, a biennial of MFA students in Chicago. And so that's sort of how I showed the work at the time. And then 2020 happened. And I was stuck inside, like we all were, and I decided to just start messing around. Something on my graduate thesis panel, one of the artists that they brought in on my Bobian, at the end, she was like, I think you're just really into materiality. I think you just want to play with that. And like, forget about this like landscape bullshit. And so I was like, I think you're right. So I started to mess more again with Polaroid. The thing that drew me to Polaroid was that it's contained. I didn't have to work with chemicals. They're small. I could do this at home. And so I started to just play with literally pushing the reagent. The chemicals live in that little section on the bottom. And I started to manually mess with it and got these friends. So I started just playing around and continued to do that for a couple of years. Like I'd go into these like highly productive times where I'd be making these and then I wouldn't make anything for like 6 months, a year. You can kind of track it with the dates, but progressively I started to do different things. So these are, instead of pushing it, I was doing a different process manually. And these are not exposed to light at all. This is just the chemistry in the Polaroid film. This one was exposed to light very quickly because these guys are really sensitive. And so I was making these at a residency at the Southwester. And I had like 8 boxes of Polaroids that I went through, and like my last 2 were these. And I was like, oh, what did I do? And really this is the one, I love this one because it was a big aha moment for me, where I had just did one thing different, and this was my last piece of film on that residency, and I was like, well, cool, we'll revisit this later, which I did later in the summer that year. I made these ones on my birthday. So these are exposed to light, but very briefly. And as I continued to make these, I tried different things. So I think this process is like, it's important to like start where you're at, because every like thing that I've done since here has been a building block to something new and something like more exciting. And it just kind of keeps getting better. And this is another one when I had COVID. I was like, I like make a lot of work when I'm sick or like stuck inside. And so I ordered some Polaroid film, and while I was in quarantine, made some of these. And this one was a big aha moment as well, because this was around that same time. This one I exposed with just regular like incandescent light. And this one, I changed my light color. And I was like, oh, what the heck? And then I remembered Polaroids are positive film, duh. Because I was thinking like it would be green or cyan or some other color. Then the pink light was pink on the Polaroid. So that was like kind of groundbreaking. And that's where it kind of took me into the more of the current work. This is some of the early haptics. And these are just pictures of light. And I'm doing a certain amount of manipulation, but a lot of it is a big surprise when after these start to develop, I haven't like a hope of what I think it's gonna look like. You know, but photography likes to be like, nah, we're gonna do something different. And each one is something I like make mental notes or make actual notes and learn from as I'm doing this. And it continues to surprise me as I make these. And then in 2025, I started to make a new set for a show I was invited to be in, which was Brief Encounters at Carnation Contemporary, which was a show about queer artists that use instant film. And so while I was like, yeah, I can make new work. I'll make like 4 or 2 new, and I made like 8. And at this point, I started to get a little more sophisticated with my approach, started to kind of control things a little bit more, still had many surprises. And because of the nature of that show, I was kind of meditating on the idea of like shape as a symbol and a meaning. And so partly because this show was specifically about queer artists, I was using the triangle as sort of the main form that I was thinking about. Folks may not know the history of the pink triangle, but it was actually originally a marker of homosexuals in the Holocaust, that gay men were imprisoned and they wore a pink triangle. But as we queers like to do, we like to take things that were nasty back and make them good. So these are examples of how in like the 70s and then the 80s with ACT UP, the pink triangle was taken back for the queer community. And so that was something that was important for me to like have as part of that work. I think a lot of people look at abstraction or photography that isn't of something and think there's not really much to it, that it's just about, I'm just messing around. But I think we get misunderstood quite a bit in what we're doing, and kind of a lot of the process is internal, but and the thing that's done is sort of like the aftermath. Like I feel like the process for me is the art. It's really intimate. And so part of that, I wanted to share I like to call them my art sisters, just the artists that have been inspirational. One of the things that was really important that I learned in graduate school was that it's important to know who came before you and to know where sort of your art lineage is. And part of that was because my thesis was writing about 3 artists. But it's true, having that knowledge of what came before you really situates yourself in what you're doing. So this is William Henry Fox Talbot. He was a 19th century scientist, created the calotype, did a whole lot of experimentation in photography. These are contact prints, so these are essentially photograms. The one above is of actual lace. It's also, if you're familiar with Anna Atkins, similar process. She was using cyanotype. But that's essentially what I'm doing. But I'm also really influenced by painters. Hilma af Klint was an amazing painter that was into like metaphysics and the occult and spirituality, and made like abstract stuff before it was really kind of ahead of its time. We didn't really learn about her until later, but definitely someone that I look at a lot now. Kazimir Malevich is also someone in, I think it was just post-World War I, sort of the avant-garde. This was considered part of suprematism. This was the first time in known history that a work of like non-representation was made, and it was kind of like, whoa, what is this? Is this even art? But it's a pretty big deal. And it's really about feeling and the sublime and something beyond. And I think too, at that point in 20th century, there was a sort of abandonment of industrialization, and especially after the wars, World War I, a lot of artists were making abstract work. And I found that to be really interesting because right now, in the current times we live in, and over this last year, I've really questioned, like, why do I make these colorful things when, like, the world is awful? And isn't there something more I could be saying? But so I started to get curious about the history of abstraction and found it fascinating that abstraction was born out of post-World War I. It was born out of a time that was traumatic. And so instead of making realistic work, artists were like, nah, I'm gonna say no to this reality and make my own reality. And so Christian Schad was an early artist that was using photography and photogram in a sort of a Dadaist way. These were pieces that were kind of random, and then contact print. Man Ray, that you may be familiar with, was also around the same time. They also like to name their stuff after themselves. Shadograph. Rayograph. Maybe I should call mine C-prints, but there's already a C-print, right? But again, these are made without a camera. They're abstract. One of my really influential artists is Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who taught at the Bauhaus and then later moved to the States and taught at IIT in Chicago. And Moholy-Nagy was like, did photography, did painting, did furniture, like all kinds of work, but was very much like into the ideas of constructivism, line, form, shape, being sort of the importance. Was very into doing photograms, kind of considered it to be like the most photography that you can get. And simultaneously, artists like Kandinsky were making work like this. Again, Kandinsky's work was more spiritual based, feeling versus the constructivists being a little bit more like, it's just form. And then, of course, we flash forward back to Rothko, who's, again, one of my favorites. Color fields are really inspirational to me, the color being the primary concern in the work. There's a flatness to it. Joseph Albers also was just like fantastic colorist. And then Barbara Kasten, who's another big influence of mine. Kasten lives in Chicago. She's 88-ish now. And I had the cool opportunity of being her assistant for a little over a year. And then COVID happened and she fired me. Barbara has been making photographic works for a long time. This is an early piece, cyanotype. She's very influenced by the Bauhaus, as you'll see in her work. This is a Polaroid. She's actually doing this. This is fully staged in a studio. These are real objects that she's photographing and lighting. So they're actually quite big. Mirrors and pieces of metal. You can see her influence on me, and also you can see kind of her own influence from the previous artists. So here she is in her studio. This was in 2019, with one of her collision pieces, and then that's a different one. And then finally, Walid Beshti is another artist that I wrote about in my thesis. Does cameraless work, very inspired by Moholy-Nagy. These pieces are quite big, and they're color photograms that he's folding the paper and then exposing to light, getting all of these different qualities of light. And I think some of you saw these when I walked in. But so when I was trying to think about, before I came to using the neon plexi, how to show these, because they didn't seem to make sense in a matted, formal frame. And then I had the opportunity to show a group show at 9 Gallery. And I was like, oh, maybe on black plexi. I like the glossiness. And then I was at Tap Plastics, and I was like, look at all these colors. And I was like, oh. And then, of course, it is a direct nod to Kasten. So sort of like I'm aware that this is not, I'm not the only person that has used this, but I use it in a different kind of way. And the cool thing about the fluorescents is that they're just naturally lit like this. And they call to the process I'm doing with using light. And usually the colors I choose are, for the background, are part of a light that I used in the process of that piece. So, at process, get your notebooks out. So yeah, I am just using your basic Polaroid film you can buy. I take it out of the cartridge, in complete darkness. The film is in complete darkness at like all times until I expose it. And little science. This is what a normal color negative looks like. This is also from the Robert Hirsch photo book. But this is like your regular film, and then this is sort of like color theory with the subtractive process in photography. But this is what a Polaroid's film looks like. It's like, because it has to have the negative sort of side of it, but it also has to have the developing side of it. So there are many, many more layers happening in the process. So that tiny little thing is doing a lot. And we could go in to get real nerdy about the light, but I'm not going to do that. But this is pretty important for me to understand what's happening. At first, I was just like doing it, being like, I don't know what's happening. And I started to see patterns in like the way the colors showed up, or a color would overlap over another color and go white. And I'd be like, I think that's because it's been exposed so much. But then looking back at this, it's actually the certain colors block other colors. So this is a handy little guide about kind of what's going on. And then this is just a diagram of what's happening in your Polaroid camera. Is the film, when you hit the exposure button, it goes through a set of rollers that then squish the reagent, and that's what spreads the chemical onto the film and therefore activates it for development. So I'm doing that, but manually, essentially, without a camera. And I usually have an idea of what I'm trying to make ahead of time. So I do, not always, sometimes it's off the cuff, but these ones are pre-planned out to a degree. And so I do a little drawing, and then that's the piece that came out. So how I'm doing this is I make stencils the size of the one-to-one size of the Polaroid, and then I cut the shapes or whatever I'm trying to do. But each stencil is one color, so one exposure. So for some of these, I have 2 colors, it's 2 stencils. Some of them that have gotten more complicated, I have 6 stencils I have to make. So it can be fairly laborious. And then you do it, and then something weird happens, or something really great happens. So that's how these happened. But when I'm making these, I'm just listening to music, sitting in darkness, and it's really, I'm not tuned in here, I'm tuned in here. Because I have to be doing all of like the move one stencil and make sure, okay, it's on there, and then like expose it and then take it out. It's like all of this stuff I'm doing, but I'm not seeing anything. So then it's really cool when I activate the reagent and then I let it sit and I set a timer. It's kind of like Christmas, and I'm like, what is it gonna do? And so then I'll like look at it in light and I'll be like, oh, or I'll be like, dang it. Because sometimes it doesn't quite work out, but you can kind of see like in this one there was like light leaks that were happening, but they ended up being really neat. And it kind of feels like that piece is on fire to me. This is one of the more complicated ones I've done. And you can see where the blue is over, where the cyan is overlapping on the yellow-orange, that went white. And my theory is that that's because the blue is not letting that color come through. Because the red and the pink do overlap, because those colors, yeah, I think that's what's happening. This is an example of me being really stubborn. So I had this, so this is the final result, but it took me a few tries to get it, because I wanted it to fully cover, to see like the triangles, and that was like the first one, and I was like, oh, the color is really good, but man, I just want it to like show it more. And then I did another one. I don't normally get that intense, like once I kind of do one, I'm like, that's what it wants to be, but this one I was like, no. I have to get this, like I have to do this one. And so it shows you this sort of variations of that, what can happen. And then like the funny things, oh, I forgot I have the weird stuff that happens that I'm not controlling, like these little gooey guys here, this is all just brilliant happenstance of kind of the pressure and chemistry that's happening. So that's like kind of the things that I can't predict. And then this is probably the most complicated one I've done. It had, I think, 6 stencils. You can see this is cut out here to get the green, and then everywhere else is covered. And this was actually the first one I did, and the colors weren't quite right. And so I did that one again and got that. And then this is just to show kind of how they look displayed and how I do that. It's just a little baby cleat on the back. And yeah. That's my talk. I left recommended reading. You guys want to get some books that I like. Also, feel free to reach out to me. It's my contact, how you can find me. Thank you again so much for being here and for listening to me talk about my work. I do have some pieces up here. If you want to get a closer look, you're welcome to come up. I have some of the older pieces here as well. So you can kind of see some of those earlier guys. Yeah, I guess questions.
Firstly, just thank you for this presentation. It's been a blessing getting to know you and my works. But my main question was, I see earlier on in your practice, you were making inkjet prints of the works, and then we can obviously tell that you're good at like the scanning and manipulation to have a digital representation of like documentation of the physical pieces. Mm-hmm. But is there an importance for it to be an original one-of object versus being a scan and then like more, because you were already doing layers of manipulation, like digital manipulation and then a print and then making a physical object? What's the importance of it being still the one-of-one object?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Nikel. It's super important for me to show these as originals. I specifically don't make inkjet print copies to like sell because it just doesn't do the same thing. There's a quality about the Polaroid, the plasticity, again, the objectness is super important. In grad school, so I was messing around with Polaroid a lot at that time too. I had tried out scanning and then making big prints on metallic paper. Metallic. Nikel does brilliant work on metallic paper. But, and they look cool, but it wasn't the same. It didn't do the same thing. And I think there's something about the size and the intimacy that you have to get up close. I mean, it'd be cool if I could make one of these like a Rothko size, Tate Modern Rothko room size, but that's, you know, maybe one day I'll get invited to Polaroid. Use the giant camera, if that's still happening. I don't know. That would be cool. But yeah, it's really important to be the thing.
So even if you wanted to scale it up, it would still have to be through that process and one of objects. Like you desire them to be bigger?
I mean, I think it'd be cool if they could be bigger, but like actually as the Polaroid, as an inkjet print, it sort of loses that light fascination and the glossiness, even with a metallic paper. It's the saturation that's happening with the inks that's different. It's just a different thing. I think photographers who have like that love of darkroom work, I think we all kind of get that. Like I struggle with digital, like even working on a computer and doing work. Like I'm a graphic designer. I do all kinds of I like doing computer work, and I can do, like with the work in grad school, that did end up being a inkjet print in the end. But where was my brain going? I just lost that thought. But yeah, there's something about it being the real thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you had the one with the triangles, that where you had to try 3 times, you should. Did you try exposing it and then running it through the camera just as the chemical spreader to see if you could get it all the way to the top?
The tricky thing about that is that the camera is still gonna like expose something. So I actually do use a roller without a camera. And I do have another machine that I haven't tried yet. So that's actually something I'm gonna try. But there's also something about the weird globs that happen. Like, I'll see if I can find an earlier one. oh, like this stuff.
Yeah.
I kind of like that. It's weird. Yeah, and I can't control that. But I am going to try some other methods of how to spread the reagent. Yeah. Although I do kind of find this progression cool to look at as well as like a piece. This guy. These to me are kind of notes, but sometimes my notes become a piece I show. Like this one. Oops, sorry, going to go back through history again. Wow! These are just like test strips to like see what the color would look like. But then I was like, I like these. They're playful, and there's like a movement happening in these that kind of feels musical to me. But that was actually, this is a note too. But
You talked a little bit about how the kind of just like leaving it sometimes, it's just what it wants to be. Can you talk a little bit about the collaborative process it seems is happening between you and the material? Like, does it feel like you're negotiating that? Or just kind of talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, like I said, as a Virgo, it can be a little frustrating to not get what I'm like set out to do. But I think part of this process and part of the practice I have with this work is not about perfection. And that's a hard thing sometimes, to not be perfect. And I do that a lot in other, like I have a practice where I drink a cocktail and I draw the cocktail as a blind contour drawing. And I have notebooks and notebooks of these. And the thing that I love about that is that there's like, for me, there's a pressure of drawing to get things to look right. And with that practice and kind of with this practice, I have to let go of that, like, and really like lean into this like imperfection that's going to happen and allow the material to sort of speak for itself. And I'm sort of like the guide along the journey. So it's really important that I'm curious throughout this process, even though I can get stubborn. Thanks for that question, Kim. Here. Oh, you got one. Okay.
I'm ready.
Sorry.
So some of the ones where there's the black globs and everything, that's the reagent not moving where you want. And so do you always use a little roller, or do you ever use just your fingers?
I started out the early work in lockdown. I was using like a stylus, a pen, like anything that, sometimes like a brayer. I've used lots of different things to see like what works better. And the most successful has been using the Polaroid rollers and just pulling it through. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering with other Polaroid films, like I've used a lot of other Polaroid stuff. We used to fool around a lot with SX70s in the 80s, like Lucas and Meier, using stylus to draw.
Mm-hmm.
But do all the Polaroid films, I don't even know what they're making anymore, but the bigger ones, can they be manipulated the same way, or do you know?
Well, I bounce between, I mean, I mostly use actual Polaroid, SX70, 600. It doesn't matter if it's for the new camera or not. So really any Polaroid film. I don't like the black and white film. It doesn't, I've found that it doesn't stay. Like it turns orange after a while, especially if you're messing with it like I am. So I don't do black and white kind of for that reason, but I also just really drawn to color.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering about the 4x5.
I was looking
Although
for
I love the square.
these.
I think the square is just a great.
Yeah, I think Fuji, I think I tried on Fuji and I wasn't getting it to do the thing, but I kind of gave up pretty early and was just like, I've got a good thing going, I'm just gonna keep going. This one I did draw on So the work I was doing in grad school with Polaroid, I was doing more actual physical manipulation too after the fact. And so with this one, I was drawing on it. These ones, I was like crushing them and like folding them. And so that was creating these sort of weird things, because this was like folded. The image itself was just a picture of a charcoal drawing I had done, and which is what this is too. This is a piece of paper crumpled, and then I took charcoal and then I put it on the wall and flashed a projection of light at it, and then I took a picture with a 4x5 camera and then scanned that and then printed it. So so the shadows that are happening here is actually the real shadows of the paper. And then this is a projected light. Yeah, but there's lots of stuff you can do with Polaroid if you set your mind to it. That's not just taking a picture.
It's great, I really think it's great.
Kind of a two-part question. Have you noticed, you've only been doing this for a few years now, but have you noticed in this level of manipulation that there's any change in like the archivability of them themselves? And is that something that negotiating or that accepting? And also I'm interested in like thinking of it as like an archivable object, like as Polaroids as archivable objects. Is there any specific relationships like the history of like queer counterculture using Polaroids as a kind of tool of like self-pronounced, self-presenting, in choosing that specific medium?
Mm-hmm. These tend to be pretty true and last as far as the archive question goes. Like I don't find, like this is pretty consistent to when it came out. I think at least with like the color Polaroid, I'm not as worried about like fading, unless it's like hung directly in sunlight. You want to be careful about how much light it's getting. But yeah, these have stayed pretty solid, so that's good. I think for me, it's maybe subconsciously connected to my queerness, but it's not because of it. I think I'm not, like that show I was in, Brief Encounters, there were a lot of other photographers that were making pretty explicit images because that is kind of the utilitarian way of Polaroid, of being able to take pictures that you wouldn't be able to get processed in public. And that's not really where I'm coming from with the Polaroid. It's more about the connection for me and the materiality. I think like with the work where I was thinking about like symbolism and the triangle, there is an element that I'm weaving in that's a bit more direct kind of a conversation. I think there's something about this work that can tap into that like kind of subconscious, unconscious work where sometimes things come out in a way that I'm not directly thinking about when I'm making it, but it kind of surfaces like later on, or I can kind of understand. Like, I think I'm wary too of the idea of this being considered queer work, because I don't want it to be like, it's like women artists are only in women artist shows, or queer artists are now just in queer shows, and that's like the emphasis. I think this is bigger than that. This is my practice as an artist, and that's a part of who I am, but it's not like the only part of why I'm making what I'm making. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I feel like looking at the lineage of your work, you can see the way in which you've gained like a greater degree of control. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to what degree you are documenting your methodologies, mm-hmm. And going back and looking at those to discover new ways to to work with the medium?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not a consistent like journaler about my work. A lot of times I just kind of have a remembrance of this, but I did when I was making these at the Southwester, I had a notebook where I was actually like keeping them all in, and I was writing down if they were exposed to light, if they weren't exposed to light, what kind of film it was, what kind of light, what different things that I was doing. So yeah, there had been times where I've been really like, this is kind of my research, as well as like a thing that I can show, but like I think all of this is research in a lot of ways. And so yeah, there have been times where I've been pretty like, this is a notebook that has lots of notes, and it sort of like when you're learning darkroom photography, especially color photography, you make notes about like what filters you were using, how many, what the combo was, so that you can kind of keep that in mind. So I was doing that. I think part of it is kind of an improvisation when I sit down to like think about the shape that I'm making. It's sometimes influenced by something I've seen, or I've got some stencils cut and I just start kind of moving them around. And so I think some of that research is just in my drawings too, these guys. And the notes on the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, is the order that I expose those. And so I kind of have a sense of like what color I'm doing next, and then I have to hide the Polaroid out of light and then change my color, and so it's kind of a mix, I guess. I'm not completely like keeping everything written down, but I think too, because like I'll do one and then I think I understand what's happening, and then I'll do another one and it does something like the exact opposite of what I thought, and so then I'm like, I don't know. But the more that I look into color theory and photo color theory specifically, the more I'm kind of getting an understanding of what's happening. But I've always been kind of let's just make a thing and see what happens, rather than like I'm gonna learn this. Like I think some photo folks are really into like the f-stub and doing the thing. And when I learned darkroom photography in high school, like half that class was in the math classroom, and just not into math. You know. And so sometimes I'm just like, no, and I just like see what happens. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you, like adding on to that, do you feel like now that you're learning this lens of how to see color that's not there, that's not happening, like you're understanding light, right? You have this little theory of light in your mind to make things in the dark. Is that then changing when you're just moving around the world? Like, are you seeing trees differently? Are you applying your light theory to just looking around and being like, there's a lot happening we don't know? Does this make sense, this question?
I think so. Yeah. Sort of. I guess I think it would be cooler if I did all the time. But it does make me think about just like the world that we don't know about so much, or the fact that like our human eyeballs can only see a certain spectrum of light, and like what this weird sea slug might look like if we could see all of the colors that like, you know? So I definitely think about, again, it kind of goes back to this idea of this sort of reality that we think we're in, that maybe we're not in. And so this is kind of a way to sort of push that. But yeah, I was thinking about like how to, I proposed like for a Sitka residency that I didn't get, but it was like, what if I like went out and started to really notice the shapes and the geometry in nature, and then that's like the shapes that I'm trying to make. And so I haven't actually done that practice yet, but it's something I've been thinking about.
Kind of relational to what you were just speaking about in terms of like bringing nature into the forms. I was curious how you arrive at the drawings to begin with, and maybe choose, apart from the triangles that you've already spoken about, how you arrive at maybe choosing the colors that you're attracted to or choosing the shapes, as well as how that might be relational to the forms that appear. And if you draw any sort of meaning or symbolism or just attention or emotionality to the forms that appear that you weren't necessarily aiming for. I'm thinking of like the works that are a little bit older where you were pushing or pulling and you're having these surprises that some of them speak to me as having forms that feel reminiscent of something else. So I was just curious if you could speak to that, the color choices a little bit.
This is a good question. I think I get a lot of inspiration from looking at other artists. So, like I mentioned, Hilma Off Clint, I've been looking a lot at her paintings and color, Kasten's work. So sometimes but I'm also limited on the colors that I can use. So sometimes, like with some of these early ones, they're pretty clear. For me, these are like big nods to Rothko, like that one. So I'll be like interested in like the colors that are in those paintings and trying to get the combos. The interesting thing though is that like in this one, this is actually red light, and that might be orange, and then it comes out a little orange and yellow. So those are some of the things that will happen where I'm like, oh, that wasn't it, but this is it. There's like in the early ones, there's kind of still a reference to like the horizon line in some way. That kind of links back to my graduate work, where I am kind of the trompe-l'oeing you a bit. But because in that work, I was interested in just how our brains want to make meaning out of anything. And so it's just like, this is a line of color, dude. But you want to make this that beach you were at last year, or, because that's what makes us brains feel safe. We make meaning and reference. And these ones, I was just like, let's make this one really gay. I want this to be trans pride. And sort of like, I feel like I have like some of these ones where I'm like, I don't know, you could find these sexy. There is queerness in these pieces that are kind of referencing that. So there was a with like this one, and its sort of sister was sort of like going for the opposite feelings, where I feel like the red and the yellow, or the orange and yellow, kind of have this, for me, feels fiery, maybe more like there's some anger in this one. And this one using green tones feels calm and like grounded. So I think that the colors do, for me, have like a sense of emotion to them. Going back to, I'm trying to think. With these ones, it was interesting how you made a reference to like seeing something in them. Which is funny because that's what I was trying not to do. But then I feel like I'm like, look, these are weird little, there's another horizon line in this one. There's like people looking at the sunset. Like one time my mom was looking at one of these and she was like, there was a chicken in there. I'm like, okay. Okay, Mom. But like this work, I was specifically trying to do that. And a lot of that was like my own, moving to Chicago from having grown up in the Northwest and growing up here and then living in Seattle a long time, I really felt a connection with the big water, big mountains, that feeling like a place where I feel at home and safe. And so being in Chicago, or even though there's big water, it was looking at it being like, what? I'm looking east and this is a lake, and everything is flat. And so I was kind of like in this space of like dealing with that kind of change that was happening in my life. But then also wanting to make you confused at what you're looking at. Yeah.
You shared a lot of great historical context and a lot of great historical inspirations, which is cool. And you share Rothko, by the way. But what current work do you find interesting or intriguing?
That's a great question. Well, I have a great opportunity of working at Blue Sky, so we look at a lot of work all the time. I would say, I mean, a lot of this, trying to think of, I mean, I get inspired by a lot of types of artists. It doesn't necessarily have to be other abstract folks, but I'm interested in people that are kind of pushing the envelope of photography. Nikel, for example, has some really beautiful work that has been pretty inspirational on color and form. This is that part where you're like, I have plenty of people I could tell you, and like it's just completely blank out of my brain. That's a good question. Well, I've had some local artists that I've shown here. I started a little DIY apartment gallery in my tiny Murphy bed nook in my apartment. And so far I've shown Natalie Crick. She's based in Seattle. She actually was also a Columbia College graduate a few years ahead of me, so we have a lot of ties of people we know. And she and I have become really good friends, and so I offered her to show a piece. I think just like having conversations with other makers and building those communities is actually, it's kind of right now less for me to be looking out in the world of who's like at MoMA, but I'm looking more here about like who's in the community and how can we make community here and support each other and inspire each other. And so part of my purpose for doing the apartment gallery is more about the invitation for a small group to come and talk about something. Like we've done a collage together using a twister spinner. And we've done like just bring a book that's inspired you. So, and it's specifically meant for Portland artists and changes every time that I do it. So the current work that I have up is Sadie Weschler, who's also based here in Portland. She just received the Guggenheim in photography. And her work is more about landscape, but the way that she does it is in a way kind of in line with my work in that she's using a lot of methods and steps to get to the final thing. So there's like more of a three-dimensional piece that she's cutting and then rephotographing, so then it ends up being shown as a flat two-dimensional thing. So I definitely am inspired by other artists, not just photographers, painters. I find actually with my work, I can sometimes have more of a connection with artists that aren't photographers. I can have more interesting conversations around color with painters than I do with photo people. I think some of the folks that, are the visual types of photographers, they get really confused with what I'm doing. And so they're more kind of like, I don't get it, how is this photography? And I'm having to be like, okay. Or they ask me what kind of lens I like, whatever. So, what's your glass? And I'm like, no, I don't. I'm like, I don't use a camera. Oh. And then I really confuse them. But I'm interested, especially, just like, I think like what we're all kind of looking for, especially post-COVID, and is that reconnection with people. So that's really kind of what I'm focused on right now.
I think that's a lot of what you're about, because I know about your catwalks.
I also co-lead a catwalk in Portland, in case you didn't know.
You're famous for it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Cool. Great questions. Thank you so much.